August 15th, 1971. It took Henry Bowman almost 6 hours to get back to the house. He pulled himself up to the door of the wood frame building and let himself in. Thank God Mom's out of town, he thought for perhaps the 10th time in 5 hours. He saw that he had dripped some blood on the wooden floor of the narrow hallway. Gotta clean that up, he told himself. There was one downstairs bath, and it was at the end of the hall. Henry pulled himself towards it, crawled through the doorway, and turned on the bathtub taps with his left hand. For 5 hours he had had an overwhelming desire to wash the blood and filth from his body, and he had the irrational fear that he would never be clean again. Henry took a steel nail file from the vanity and managed to cut off his t-shirt with his left hand. The torn gym shorts that he had tied crudely to his jockstrap came off next. Henry climbed in the tub without making any attempt to remove his shoes or socks and let the water level slowly rise to cover his battered body. Lying in the cool water was the first thing that had felt even a little bit pleasant in what seemed like an eternity. While he soaked, Henry focused on how the water felt and tried to ignore the fact that it was starting to exhibit a slight pink tint. He also tried not to think about his shoulder. Breakfast of champions, Henry Bowman thought with an inward chuckle as he noticed that the sun was starting to appear on the horizon. He was naked except for his shoes and socks, and was sitting on 2 towels so he wouldn't get blood on the kitchen chair. The liquor cabinet hadn't been opened in at least a year, but Henry had found it well stocked, mostly with unopened bottles. Henry Bowman had had ample opportunity to drink beer in college, but his first bottle had also been his last. He hated the taste. Henry had also once tried a scotch on the rocks, which was his Uncle Max Collins' drink of choice. One sip of that had been enough to convince him that there were some personal preferences that were utterly beyond his comprehension. Looking through the dusty cabinet, he had recalled that gin and 7-Up was a drink he had heard several people order at a party his mother had given for some of her friends. Henry liked the soft drink, and had decided the mixing it with gin was worth a try. On the table in front of him was a quart bottle of gin that was now half full, 2 empty 7-Up bottles, and a plastic bucket with a few slivers of ice floating in some very cold water. Henry could see his reflection in the black glass of the double-stack oven across the kitchen. His dislocated shoulder was very prominent, and the bottles and ice bucket in front of him made the image surreal. The bartender from hell, Henry thought as he touched his glass to his lips and tipped it up. The cold liquid coursed down his throat, straight from Aphrodite's breast. Tastes even better than that first one did. He drained the glass, then poured a slug of straight gin into it, and took a swallow. Burns. Need more 7-Up. He looked over towards the refrigerator. His ankle felt good enough to walk on, a few yards at least. He stood up, and dizziness swept over him. Better do the other thing first while I can still function, he decided. With unsteady steps, Henry made it over to the wrought iron pot rack which hung by a short length of 1/4 inches chained from a steel plate in the ceiling. His father had installed it in 1964, and Henry knew that the plate was held in place by 2 3/8 inches lag bolts, which went through the plaster and screwed 5 inches into one of the 2 PEX 10 joists that held up the second floor. Henry smiled as he climbed on the chair. Thanks for building a pot rack you could hook a block and tackle to and use to pull an engine swap, Dad. He reached for the free end of the plastic-coated electrical extension cord he had earlier looped through the chain. The chair creaked under his weight of 190 pounds. If anyone else had done it, damn thing might rip out of the ceiling and fall on my head. Henry tied the knot in the extension cord as best he could with his left hand. Hope it holds. He pulled on the cord and it bit into his skin. Probably tear it some. No matter. Henry made a last test to see that the cord was taut and took a deep breath. He had thought it through for several hours now, and there just wasn't any choice. If you got a frog to swallow, best not to look at it too long, he thought. Henry Bowman clenched his teeth and fists and abruptly threw himself off the chair with a twisting motion. There was a loud crack and then blackness. When Henry Bowman regained consciousness, his whole right side was screaming in protest, but it was his right hand that screamed loudest. When he opened his eyes, the room was blurred and sideways, and his stomach was doing some very unpleasant things. Henry was hanging by his right wrist, connected to the chain in the ceiling by the electrical cord. His knees were almost touching the linoleum floor. With considerable effort, Henry got his left leg under him and managed to stand up. This took all the tension taken off the cord. Henry's right wrist and shoulder still hurt, but not quite as much. He examined his right hand. It was almost the color of eggplant. Jesus, how long was I out? Henry wondered. He rotated his shoulder, noting with satisfaction that, although it hurt like hell, it seemed to work all right. Then he set to untying the extension cord from his right wrist. It took longer than he expected, for when he had tied the cord, he had had the presence of mind to wrap it tightly several times above the bone, so that his makeshift technique would not dislocate his right wrist in the process of fixing his shoulder. When he was finished unwrapping the cord, Henry was rewarded with the sensation that 1,000 tiny needles were being jabbed into his swollen right hand. He flexed his fingers repeatedly, watching them closely. Wouldn't do to lose the use of my trigger finger, he thought with a smile. It was the amusement that comes from being either exhausted or drunk, and Henry Bowman was both. He walked unsteadily back towards his seat at the kitchen table, then remembered he needed 7-Up to mix with his gin. He retrieved 2 more bottles from the refrigerator, popped the caps off on a drawer handle, and set them on the table next to the liquor. He filled his glass with ice from the freezer, and set about the serious business of finishing the rest of the alcohol. The bottle was not quite empty, but Henry Bowman's bladder demanded emptying, and so he staggered to the bathroom. He leaned against the wall and began to relieve himself in the toilet. It was then that he saw the blood in his urine. One end stops and the other starts, he thought, as he squeezed his eyes shut. Henry flushed the toilet and then lay down on the bathroom's tile floor, still naked except for shoes and socks. He curled himself into a ball, and soon his body was racked with violent, uncontrollable sobs. Didn't do anything, he said to himself over and over. He was filled with an immense shame. To be sure, Henry felt shame for the terrible thing that he had been forced to endure, but there was something else that made it much worse. It was something that Henry Bowman had been trying without success to forget ever since the moment that the car had arrived and the 4 men had fled. Henry Bowman knew beyond any doubt whatsoever that the men who had attacked him would do the exact same thing again to someone else. Of this fact he was absolutely certain, just as he knew that winter would arrive in 4 or 5 months, and that it would be hot again this time next year. Those men would do it again and again after that, and when they did, their next victims might not be able to crawl home. Their next victims might not be left with their eyesight, Henry knew, and he had to fight to keep from vomiting. And I didn't do anything, didn't hurt them, didn't mark a one of them, didn't even keep my eyes open so I could see what they looked like. Henry Bowman knew in his heart that he was not the final victim of the 4 men he had encountered that night, and he was absolutely right about that. More victims followed. There were several other things, however, that Henry did not know, at least not yet. Henry Bowman did not know, but would eventually come to learn, that men comprised a full 10% of all rape victims in the United States, and almost a third of the victims of gang rapes. Henry Bowman did not know that one day he would actually consider himself lucky that what had happened to him that night had occurred in 1971 and not 2 decades later. By that time, the AIDS virus would guarantee that any homosexual gang rape that caused rectal bleeding was a virtual death sentence for the victim. Last of all, Henry Bowman did not know that the reason that he had never seen his late father take a drink was not, as he had always assumed, that Walter Bowman had not liked alcoholic beverages. That was not true at all. The reason that Walter Bowman had shunned liquor all of his life was that the people on his side of the family, particularly the men, had a genetic predisposition towards alcoholism. November 10th, 1971. Henry, your grades have fallen off a cliff compared to what we've come to expect from you. I'm looking at a C- average for this semester. James Nelson knew something was wrong. Lots of students had similar grades, particularly those who spent their class hours at war protests. Few, however, had had B+ averages the entire previous year. Henry Bowman looked at his faculty advisor. There wasn't much he wanted to say. I've had some personal problems this year, Henry said quietly. Like I have nightmares every night. I can't get it up. My girlfriend kissed me off, and I'm sick to death of classes, he added silently. Is it this double major you're working on? Nelson asked. You know, that kind of commitment. It would be much better if you eased off on one or the other and did a real job on the one that's the most important to you. Henry smiled sadly and shook his head. That's not it. It's other things. Look, I'm in a slump right now, Professor Nelson. That happens to people, doesn't it? He asked reasonably. It's not terminal, he added with a grin. I suppose you're right, James Nelson said, but he was not at all convinced. I'll see you on Thursday, Henry said brightly as he turned to leave the man's office. Got to get some ice from the dining hall, he thought. Maybe one of the guys that works there can scare up a lime for me, too. Then I'll hit a couple more cemeteries. December 20th, 1971. Henry Bowman had never flown with a hangover before, and he didn't like it. It was the first time he could ever remember flying a plane and not enjoying himself. The fact that he had the major part of a 10-hour cross-country ahead of him did not make things any better. Why didn't I ease off last night, he asked himself for the fourth or fifth time since takeoff. Winter flying was normally smooth, but there was a fair amount of turbulence in the air, and that irritated Henry also. Since when do bumpy conditions bother an aeropilot, huh, dipshit? He glanced at the altimeter and saw that his altitude was almost 100% above his intended level of 8,500 feet, and he shook his head in disgust. Thank God my father isn't alive to see me right now, he thought, as he eased the stick forward a millimeter but put the Piper into a slight descent. Feeling much better, Henry thought with a smile as the city of Pittsburgh slowly disappeared behind him. He pulled the 6 new birth certificates out of his pocket and looked at them once more. Henry had no idea what he was going to do with the documents, but it had been an adventure getting them, along with social security numbers and other attendant proofs of legitimacy. Henry had spent much of the last 2 months on his spy project, as he thought of it. Occasionally during that time he worried that because of what had happened to him the previous summer, he had developed an unhealthy fixation on trying to take absolute control of his future. He knew, intellectually at least, that no person could insulate himself entirely from random events. The fact was, though, that in the fall of 1971, Henry Bowman had lost interest in almost all things in his life except drinking gin and pursuing the secret project he had undertaken. And the alternative ID scheme was fun. It occupied Henry's mind and stimulated his creativity at a time when everything else seemed excruciatingly boring. After the unexpected success of acquiring the first birth certificate, Henry had decided to get others, of slightly different ages, from other areas. The game metamorphosed into one where Henry Bowman imagined himself with a lissom female companion, and that led to getting birth certificates for 3 dead girls in addition to the ones of the deceased boys. The 3 boys had been born in 1949, 1952, and 1956, and had all died between 1950 and 1958. 2 of the 3 girls had been born in 1955 and 1956. Had died at the age of 2 days in 1961. The birth certificates had been sent to 6 different addresses in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia, which was not inconvenient for a young man who had an airplane that carried a 10-speed bike with quick detachable hubs. Henry glanced at his fuel gauges, about half since the last fuel stop. He looked over his shoulder to make sure nothing was lying in the back of the plane. Henry Bowman's classmates had been very amused by the fact that Henry had sent his clothes home ahead of him via UPS so he could fly home for Christmas break in an empty plane. Good reason for that, Henry thought as he made a few clearing turns, then lowered the nose and watched as the airspeed built to 150 miles per hour. Henry abruptly gave the engine full throttle and pulled the stick back in his lap, releasing back pressure when the plane was exactly vertical. Henry took quick glances at the horizon and the airspeed indicator while keeping the plane on the exact path with tiny movements of the stick and rudder. When his airspeed was almost 0, he gave the airplane full left rudder, executing a hammerhead turn. The clipwing cub pivoted on the axis described by Henry's spine and pointed straight at the ground. Henry then chopped the throttle to idle, pulled the stick back in his lap again, and gave the cub full right rudder. This stalled the right wing, putting the plane into a vertical snap roll. After 1 full revolution, Henry reversed the rudder pedals and shoved the stick forward, breaking the plane out of the snap roll after 1.5 turns. He let the speed build for 2 more seconds, then pulled the stick smoothly back into his lap and pulled out of the vertical dive on his original heading. Not bad, Henry told himself with a smile. He avoided thinking about how the same maneuver would have made him feel 4 hours earlier. Henry also avoided thinking about the dismal performance he had turned in on 3 of his final exams for the semester. December 29th, 1971. Hello? Dick, that you? Joe Hammond, how are your holidays going? Yeah, real good, Mr. Hammond. Let me go get Mom. No, hold up, she's probably busy and I've only got a minute. It's you I called to talk to. Oh? Dick Gaines said warily into the phone. Yeah, Hammond said expansively. He had several drinks in him. Thought I'd see if you were interested in an internship for the first half of this coming summer. Congressman Sloan said he could use another good man the last couple of months before the end of the session when things get kind of wild. Congressman Sloan in Washington? Dick Gaines asked in amazement. That's the one. Actually, what he needs is a couple more bodies on the payroll to help cover his tracks on the dough he's been stealing. But you don't need to know about that, Hammond added. Yes, Gaines exclaimed. Yes, yes, yes. Then his face fell. I don't know if Mom and Dad will let me, though. I already squared it with them for you. Merry Christmas, Dick, a few days late. Dick Gaines was speechless. That's wonderful, Mr. Hammond, he said finally. Thank you. No trouble at all. Give your mother my love. Bye. Bye, Gaines said softly as he heard the line disconnect. Congressman Sloan! The thought thrilled him. Then he frowned. Now I got to make sure I pass algebra next semester, so I don't have to take any summer school classes again. Henry, you're an alcoholic. What the hell are you talking about? The accusation had taken him entirely by surprise, and it made him very angry. I can smell it on you right now, Carol Weston said without backing down. You've had a lot to drink, today already, and it's barely 6 o'clock. Carol Weston was Henry Bowman's closest female friend from high school. They had been in dramatics class together, and Henry had thought her high school boyfriend was a jerk. Now Carol had a new college beau she had met at her school in Florida. From what she had told him about the fellow, Henry thought he sounded okay. Henry turned sideways in the seat of his mother's Buick station wagon and took another bite out of his hamburger. He was trying to appear relaxed instead of upset. For God's sake, Carol, I didn't even drink beer in high school. Now I come back home from my sophomore year in college during Christmas break. There's parties just about every night. I have a few drinks like everybody else. And now, sitting here in the parking lot at Steak and Shake, you say I'm an alcoholic? Where the hell does that come from? You've changed, Henry. I might not have noticed, or I might have thought it was because all of us are off in college now and we're all a little different from the way we were in high school. Except my mother became an alcoholic after Daddy left, and when I see you now I see a difference, and it's exactly the same thing I saw with her. I can't believe I'm hearing this, Henry said in amazement. Have I been mean to you, or anyone else? Have you seen me yelling or staggering around, or have my hands been shaking, or... Henry tried to think of other things that alcoholics did. Or anything like that? He said finally. You were almost half an hour late to Kelly's house Monday night. Late? How can you be half an hour late to a party? That's ridiculous. Henry, every party you ever went to when we were in school together, you showed up exactly at the time. On the invitation. All of us girls used to laugh about it. One time I was helping with Irene Cohen's party and you showed up at her house at 6 minutes after 7. I told her that her clock was probably 6 minutes fast, and when she called time and temperature it was. So since I used to show up at parties exactly on time and now I arrive 20 minutes late, that means I'm an alcoholic. Henry was smiling, and Carol Weston wanted to join him, but she held her ground. When did you start drinking today? She demanded. I haven't been drinking today, he lied. If you smell liquor on me, it's what I had at my aunt's house last night, sweating out of me. Carol Weston nodded in acceptance. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. Is there any in the car right now? I could use a little something, even if you're not going to have one. No, I'm afraid there isn't, Henry lied again. What made her guess I'd have a bottle under the back seat, he wondered. Okay, no big deal. She picked up some more French fries and put them in her mouth. You been flying your plane much? She asked, changing the subject. Every week, he answered. Actually, more like every other week lately. Flew at home, Henry added with a shrug. That's 10 hours almost. Carol Weston began to get an idea. You still do those stunts? She asked. Henry had taken Carol flying the previous summer, and had shown her a loop, a snap roll, and finally a 5-turn spin. She had been both terrified and exhilarated, particularly by the last maneuver. Sure. Take me right now, she said suddenly. Take me up in your plane and do that thing where everything whirls around and I thought I was going to die. It's called a spin, Henry corrected. He shook his head. Carol, it's dark out. I don't do aerobatics at night. It's not safe. You can get disoriented too easily. That's a good way to get killed. Carol Weston snorted. You told me when we did it that day last summer that all you had to do was push the rudder the other way and let go of everything, and the plane would start flying okay by itself. Isn't that what you said? Well, yes, but then let's go. You said you'd take me anywhere I wanted to go tonight so long as we didn't have to get dressed up. I want to go do a spin in your airplane. Henry Bowman shook his head. No. If you take me up in your airplane right now and do a spin, I'll go to bed with you, Carol said suddenly. She had not decided what she would do if he said yes. What? Henry Bowman exclaimed as he almost choked on his hamburger. You always had a crush on me in high school, she said quickly. I knew it all the time, and you even admitted it to me last summer. Take me flying, and then we'll go to bed together. Carol, Henry said, completely overwhelmed by the way the evening was going, you've got that new guy from Rollins Bill, isn't it, that you're crazy about. You can't just... Henry Bowman, you are the biggest liar in the whole world. Carol Weston almost shouted. When in your life have you ever cared about what some other guy felt when it came to going after a girl? Particularly a guy you've never even met. Henry's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Carol was right, and he was dumbstruck. You've been drinking today, and that's why you won't take me flying now, isn't it? You can drive a car when you're about to pass out. You can go slow, and maybe you'll scrape the curb, but everything will be. Okay, I should know. Mom used to do it all the time. But if you take me flying and something goes wrong, we'll both die, and you know it. Henry nodded. I did drink today. Carol said nothing. Most of the afternoon, off and on, he added. She remained silent. I won't fly with liquor still in my system. He shook his head. Let the nose stay down a little too long coming out of some maneuvers. You can overspeed the airframe in a hurry. Make the tail come off. He looked up at his friend and smiled. Carol saw that his eyes were wet. I may show up late for parties now and worry about what out-of-town boyfriends might think, but I won't fly a plane with alcohol in my bloodstream. Carol Weston took his hand and squeezed it. What happened to you, Henry? She said softly. Henry Bowman took a deep breath. He wanted to tell her, but his shame was so thick it was palpable, and he found he could not talk about the rape. He ended up giving Carol an edited version of what had happened that night in August. The attack by the 4 men was revised into one of terrible violence, but without the sexual component. The gang's motive was unknown, although since it was night, mistaken identity was possible. Henry explained that he had received a severe beating, which was true enough, and that the men had run when a car had come by and shone its bright lights on them, which was true as well. Henry told Carol Weston that he had nightmares about that night, but that alcohol seemed to prevent them. This was also true. However, the last time Henry Bowman had gone to sleep completely sober had been over a month ago, so he could not honestly say that the nightmares were still returning whenever he quit drinking. He admitted this fact also. Have you ever gone back on your word? Carol asked after they had talked for a while. No, not that I know of. Wonder where this is heading. Then I'm going to hold you to it. We're going someplace tonight where you don't have to get dressed up. I go there with Mom sometimes, and we might run into someone I'd like you to meet. He's a pilot for TWA, and he goes there a lot. They've got good coffee, which I know you hate, but I like it, and you can drink sodas. It's not far from here. Guess I'd better shut up and do what she says, Henry told himself. I just hope she was kidding about going to bed. I don't need another disaster tonight. Okay, tell me where to turn, Henry said as he twisted the key in the ignition and started the engine. East on Clayton Road past the movie theater to Bellevue, she replied. Henry Bowman was about to go to his first AA meeting, March 10th, 1972. More dead Ray near the border. Ray Johnson looked over at his head tracker. There were 3 nationalist groups in Angola: the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, the Front for the Liberation of Angola, FNLA, and the Union for Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. It was this last group that was most prevalent in the local area. Contrary to what was implied by the names of the 3 groups, all of them spent most of their time fighting amongst themselves, despite the fact that their goals were, in theory at least, similar. More and more often, internal disagreements among the leaders and the members were turning bloody. How many? Raymond asked. 10, maybe 20. Johnson shook his head. Damned bohunks are going to get tired of putting up with this shit one of these days. Thank God all my real funds are in Rhodesia. He looked around at the camp he and his workers had built. Been a good 9 years. Time to get serious about moving on. Ray Johnson's premonition was accurate. 2 years later, the Portuguese military would enact a coup and Portugal would immediately grant its Angolan colonies independence. The 3 nationalist groups would continue their war, with the U.S. and China supporting the FNLA, the Soviet Union and Cuba assisting the MPLA, and South Africa backing UNITA. Over a decade later, the FNLA would fade away and the other 2 groups would continue their fighting. By that time, however, Ray Johnson would be long gone.
Man, that was bizarre, wasn't it?
What do you mean? Henry Bowman asked as they walked out the men's room and headed for the exit door. 5-hour documentaries were taxing on the bladder even when they were shown on successive nights. Just the whole way the French reacted. I mean, those were Nazis, for God's sake. Did you catch some of what they were saying? Unbelievable. The young man shook his head at the thought. At Amherst, as at most colleges, films shown for specific courses were open to all students so long as seats were available. At Henry's urging, he and another geology major had just spent 2 nights viewing a film that one of the European history classes had screened, The Sorrow and the Pity. It was a Swiss documentary on occupied France during World War II. You have to realize many people saw those Nazis the same way we see policemen. What are you talking about? Well, Henry said, cops are around, but the place isn't crawling with them, right? Here in the U.S., I mean. Yeah, same way in most of France back in 42, especially if you lived in the south part of the country. For most people, life was pretty much the same as before. You lived in the same house, went to the same grocer, same doctor, had the same job, all that. You just kept your head down. Henry thought of something. Look, when you glance in your rearview mirror and see a police car behind you, you wish he wasn't there, right? You don't want him around, do you? And it isn't just you. Your parents probably pay loads of taxes, and they're the same way, right? Yeah, I guess so. But what would you or your dad do if someone riding in the back of your car said, "Oh Christ, a goddamn cop's following us," and leaned out the window and blasted him? You'd shit, right? Henry was becoming animated. And if you saw some stranger kill a cop, the same cop who just gave you a speeding ticket because he had to make his ticket quota, what would you do? Would you clap and say, "Good riddance, asshole"? Hell no, you'd immediately report it. You'd give a full description, and you'd read in the papers about the patrolman's fine record. You'd hear about the number of arrests he made, and how he'd been promoted to lieutenant sooner than anyone else in his class at the academy, and what a good husband and father he was, and you'd see a picture of his grieving widow and 3 fatherless kids, and you'd feel really sorry for them, even though at the same time you're trying to figure out what to do about car insurance since you got canceled. It was the same way with the Nazis. To most French people, the Krauts were just policemen giving out speeding tickets and roughing up long-haired war protesters, and the guys in the resistance were kind of like the Black Panthers. Except with correct grammar and better-tasting breakfasts, he added as an afterthought. I can't believe that, the friend said. The Nazis weren't police, they killed their own citizens. Henry turned to face his friend and shook his head. You don't think cops in this country 35 years ago helped lynch black guys? Weren't those black guys citizens here? Nazis were just police in a police state. They had wives and kids and worried about paying the mortgage and whether they'd get laid after a hard day's work at the death camp, just like Deputy Billy Bob in Alabama worries about making the payment on his pickup truck while he's wiping the blood off his nigger knocker. Henry gathered his thoughts and went on. Look, Hitler's goal was to rule all of Europe, not destroy it, right? What did that mean? It meant crushing the dissenters, not killing off everyone. People like our parents, Krauts left them alone, gave them brownie points when they ratted out the troublemakers. You're from Chicago. Did your parents or any of their friends have anything to worry about during the '68 convention? No, they didn't have long hair, and they weren't out holding up protest signs. I bet some of them were even glad to see those irritating hippies get their heads busted. Am I right? Henry went on before his friend could answer. Hell, you know the history, Henry said, unaware that his friend did not. After Poland in 39, Denmark and Norway rolled over for the Krauts in 40. Took a week or so. Luxembourg took a day. Holland lasted about 5. Belgians held out for 2 weeks, then caved in. Brits sent troops to northern France to try to help the frogs fight off the Germans. France lasted a few weeks, and the only reason it took that long instead of a day or two was that Joe Stalin kept half the German army occupied on the Russian front, losing about 10 million soldiers of his own in the process. As soon as the Krauts drove the Brits away at Dunkirk, France rolled over and spread her legs right now. Germans went into Paris unopposed in June of 1940. Italy said it was neutral, but when Mussolini saw the Krauts were about to kick off their shoes and put their feet up in the Louvre, he jumped into Hitler's arms like a waterfront whore when the troop ship pulls into port. Churchill was determined not to cave in, but the Brits hauled ass out of Greece, and they hauled ass out of Yugoslavia. When the Brits hauled ass out of France, they managed to leave all their guns behind at Dunkirk. Don't ask me why. The folks in England finally figured out they were next on Hitler's shopping list, so they hunted up all the grouse guns and hunting rifles in the country, which wasn't much against MG-34 belt-feds and MP-40 submachine guns. They were so desperate they even ran around to museums and got spears, since they didn't have anything to fight with. We shipped over boatloads of real guns, but England still would have been fucked if Germany hadn't declared war on us a few days after Pearl Harbor, which was why we went over and saved their bacon. Henry realized he had gotten off the subject. Those old guys they showed in the movie, the ones who had been in the resistance, they said right on film that the only reason they were in the resistance at all was they were communists, and Stalin told M. Hitler was almost to Moscow. People in France viewed those guys as a bunch of nuts. That was the resistance movement. How do you know so much about it? Henry shrugged. Went to a good high school. My dad was a history teacher at a local college, and other relatives of mine were right in the middle of the worst of it with the Nazis. They've all told me what it was like the way it was for them while it was happening. By the middle of 1941, Krauts owned all of Europe except Switzerland and England. Germany had the war won just about. Switzerland, of course, would have kept its independence. Just like today, in 1941, every Swiss citizen had a machine gun and a bunch of ammo in his house. They've been practicing blowing their bridges and carrying out mountain ambushes for a couple centuries, so they were ready to slaughter the Krauts in the Alps and get back home in time for dinner. Hitler wasn't about to fuck with that country, even with Mussolini's dick. But Great Britain was hanging on by its fingertips, and old Joe Kennedy, our ambassador to England, he was sending back cables to Roosevelt saying, "Hey pal, you're backing the wrong horse in this one." Henry shook his head. You don't go to sleep one night a free man and wake up the next morning to find you're a slave in your own country. It happens gradually, and when you realize it, it's too late. He looked at his friend. You know about frogs and hot water? The young man shook his head. Toss a frog in a pot of boiling water, and he'll jump out because it's boiling. That's like you looking at a picture of Jews being used for medical experiments at a concentration camp. Ah, how awful, Henry mimicked. But stick the frog in a pot of room temperature water and put it on the stove and he'll swim around happily until he's dead. Henry laughed without humor. That's why when these people in France and Holland and Norway and Luxembourg and Denmark and Belgium and Yugoslavia and Great Britain let themselves get put in a position of helplessness, they had to beg for a country which hadn't been so stupid to bail them out. What do you mean those countries didn't have guns? I don't believe that. The Germans just had more tanks and cannons and bombs and all that. Sure, they had guns, but almost all of them were in the military. The people didn't have jack shit. We actually airdropped a bunch of stamped steel single-shot 45 pistols into occupied France to try to help them out. The damn thing didn't even have a rifled barrel. It was a smoothbore, basically a zip gun. A real piece of junk. That was how little the French people had to protect their freedom with. And about the cannons and bombs, they work real well when all you got to worry about is knocking out some fortified spots. They don't solve your problem when every single citizen of the country you're invading has a good rifle and knows how to use it. Hell, some Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto who didn't know a thing about shooting held off the German army for over a month, and all the guns they had wouldn't fill up the trunk of that car there, Henry said, pointing to a 1969 Chevrolet Impala. Every time German army troops looked for him, a bullet would come out of a window somewhere and zap the commanding officer. Krauts finally had to burn the whole city to kill them. And speaking of guns and protecting yourself, I've got to get cracking. This thing I'm teaching at UMass has its first session in about 20 minutes. Catch you in GO class, rock jock. Henry Bowman started to jog towards the campus parking lot. Henry's friend watched him go. For quite a long time he thought about the things Henry Bowman had said. Good evening, welcome to class. I know a few of you already, but for those I haven't met, my name is Henry Bowman. He looked out at the group in front of him and saw a few skeptical looks. This was originally planned as a co-ed class, but there appears to be little or no interest among the men in the area, at least not right now. I suspect that at least some of you are here out of curiosity and aren't at all sure what this course is about or if you want to take it. You can't ask anyone to advise you about it either, because this is the first time I've taught it. I'm going to ask that you agree to one thing. I know that really listening carefully is extremely tiring. An hour of it, if you really do it, is exhausting. I'm going to ask that you listen to me carefully for 10 minutes with an open mind about what you hear. I'll warn you right now that I'm going to say some things that will almost certainly upset you and that you will disagree with. When that happens, I want you to promise me that for the next 10 minutes, you will not. Tune out and quit listening. I want you to promise that you will not spend all your time preoccupied with the outrageous thing I just said and miss what comes next. I want you to promise me that for 10 minutes and 10 minutes only, you will pay attention to every word I say as if your life depended on it. After 10 minutes is up, I want each of you to think about what I've said and decide if you want to listen to anything else I have to say. If not, I won't ask for any more of your time. Does that sound fair? There were several startled murmurs among the young women in the lecture hall. Henry saw a few tentative nods of acceptance. Okay, good, 10 minutes. Henry Bowman took a deep breath and made eye contact with each of the 17 women in front of him. A close relative of mine was violently gang-raped. The rapists were talking about blinding her so she could not identify them when they were interrupted by a stranger. And they ran. Henry breathed deeply and went on. The rape left her physically injured and emotionally devastated. The physical injuries have healed. The emotional damage will take longer. Some of you may have stories you could tell about one of your own relatives, friends, or perhaps about yourself. He nodded, deciding what would come next. I studied everything I could about that rape and others, so that the terrible price that the victims paid would not have been for nothing. That's why I'm here talking about personal protection. Personal protection, Henry said in loud voice. When you signed up for this not-for-credit course that the university agreed to offer and that I volunteered to teach, all of you had your own ideas of what personal protection meant, and those ideas were probably all different. What I think each of you shares is a realization that there are times in your life when you are not safe, and you want to do something about it. And that something, whatever it is important enough that you came to a not-for-credit class you know nothing about other than its title, taught by someone you'd never heard of, on the chance that it might give you something of value. This course is going to teach you how to avoid becoming a victim of violent crime. I am not going to tell you how to keep your dorm room from being burglarized when you are out, how to prevent the girl down the hall from stealing your checks and looting your bank account, or how to keep your jewelry from being taken while you're in the shower. Those things aren't important enough for me to bother with. I won't mince words here. The course I'm going to teach is how to see to it that you never ever become the victim of a violent physical attack that results in rape, crippling injury, lasting emotional damage, or death. Henry looked around and saw that he had their undivided attention. I am also not going to tell you how to rearrange your life so that you avoid all situations with any potential for danger. Frankly, I don't think that can be done. Even if it could, I would still not be willing to let violent predators dictate the way in which I live my life. If you're willing to stay inside a locked building and only venture out in big groups, you don't need me or anyone else to teach you how to do it. What I am going to teach you is how to be prepared for the sudden, unexpected, violent attack so that if it ever does come, you will instantly do the thing that has the greatest chance of stopping that attack and saving both your dignity and perhaps your life. Still got their interest, Henry thought. Good. He strolled casually across the front of the lecture hall as he talked, his hands behind his back. Henry sat back against the table at the front of the room and palmed a new white tennis ball from his open gym bag behind him. I am going to help you gain skill and confidence. I am going to help you develop certain reactions until they are instinctive. Without warning, he tossed the tennis ball underhanded to a girl in the fourth row. As the ball arced towards her through the air, she looked very startled, then recovered, dropped her pen, reached out her hands, and caught the ball. Henry smiled and looked around the rest of the class. I'd like all of you to think about what you just saw. In less than 1 second, this woman did a whole list of things instinctively. She recognized that something was suddenly flying through the air at her. She identified it as a slow-moving tennis ball and therefore not a danger to her. She let go of the pen she was holding. She analyzed the trajectory of the ball and brought her hands up to the proper position. Then, the instant the tennis ball touched her hands, she closed her fingers around it before it could bounce out. Less than 1 second. She wasn't born with that skill. Try what I just did with a 2-year-old, and you'll be lucky if she even blinks before the ball bounces off her head. He smiled and nodded at the woman holding the ball. No one noticed that as he talked, Henry took a butter knife from his pocket, concealed it in the palm of his right hand. The difference is that in 20 years, each of you have seen a lot of things flying through the air. He was strolling in front of the 3 women in the front row as he spoke. The one nearest him was a muscular, athletic-looking brunette. You've all had enough snowballs, tennis balls, car keys, and frisbees tossed or thrown at you that you react without thinking. You duck the snowball and reach out for the car keys, even when there's no warning. As he spoke these words, he stepped next to the brunette so that his hip was almost touching her shoulder and held the polished knife against the far side of her neck. One sound and I'll cut you bad, cunt, Henry Bowman said in a savage whisper. There was a collective gasp from almost the entire class. A few of the women, including the one he had addressed, froze silently in utter shock. Henry waited to a count of 5, then stepped back, held up the butter knife, and ran it roughly across his hand to show how dull it was. None of you have had anything like that happen often enough to have developed any kind of instinctive response. Every one of you froze. Henry stepped to the table and picked up the gym bag. My time isn't up yet, he warned the class as a whole, then held the bag out to the woman he had just pretended to threaten. She shied away from him. Soap, clean towels, and fresh sweats in here. Second door on the left in the hallway. Wash your face in cold water and come back, he whispered. Go. The girl took the bag and Henry could see she was about to get up and run out of the room. She glared at him, then looked at her watch. In 6 minutes, when you're done, she hissed, slouching back in her seat. Henry nodded and turned to the class. To cope with the situation I just demonstrated, you need 3 things. First, you need experience and preparation so that the unexpected does not paralyze you. You need to be ready for what I just did. You need to be just as familiar and prepared as you would be with a snowball flying at you in the middle of January. Second, you need to learn what to do and then work on it, so that your instinctive reaction is the right one, and not something that will make the problem worse. Defending against violence is a lot more complicated than ducking a snowball, and because of that, it takes a lot more practice. The third thing you need is something that I have never seen mentioned in any discussion of personal protection and defense. It is also the one thing that is far and away the most important. For want of a better term, I call it the warrior mentality, and it's something I'm going to stress over and over in this class. If you have it, you're going to have the greatest possible likelihood of retaining not only your life and good health, but also your dignity and self-respect. As Henry looked at the 17 faces, he saw interest, hostility, disbelief, curiosity, puzzlement, and skepticism. He did not see boredom. I'm going to ask all of you to imagine something, and then I'd like one of you to volunteer to pretend you're being interviewed. He gave what he hoped was a self-effacing smile. I won't threaten you, yell, or use bad language. I'll stand right here, I promise. Henry licked his lips and went on. Imagine for a moment that tonight you were the victim of a premeditated, intentional assault. It was dark, you got some bruises in the attack, and the attacker ran off. I'll let you decide the other circumstances and the specifics of the assault. The hospital people looked you over, calmed you down, and you're shaken but okay. The soreness seems to be gradually going away. He looked at each student. Anyone willing to be interviewed? Silence lasted a few seconds, then one young woman spoke. She was of medium height and wore tennis shoes, cut-off shorts, and a t-shirt. Henry could see that she was lean and muscular, with long, slender legs and good calves. She looked as if she spent a lot of time outside. Yeah, go ahead, she told him. Henry smiled at her and nodded. Ma'am, Henry started, I understand that today a man assaulted you and you were roughed up. Can you tell me something about exactly what happened? I was walking to my car. As I was getting my keys out of my purse, suddenly there was a man beside me. I don't know if he'd been following me or what. He tried to take my purse. How did he do that? He grabbed at it. He just tried to rip it out of my hands. I wasn't thinking. I held on to it. It was instinctive, you know? Someone tries to pull something out of your hands, you just hold tighter. Henry saw some of the others nodding, and he did the same. He could tell the woman was getting involved with the role play. So then what happened? I started to scream. Before I could, though, he hit me with his fist. He hit me in the jaw. I felt this terrible pain in my face, and I fell down. My wrist is sore, too. Did he get your purse? Yes, he ran away with it. Anything in it he could use? Money, credit cards? Yes, both of those. I see, Henry said. Is this woman really role-playing, or did something like this actually happen to her, he wondered. If you don't mind my saying so, you certainly look very athletic, he said, changing the subject. Why didn't you just run away? The young woman actually smiled at the question. I was wearing heels and a long skirt at the time. I was returning from a job interview, but the man surprised me. Even if I'd had on my track shoes, I probably would have done the same thing. Holding onto the purse was, as you were talking about, instinctive. Any guesses why the man picked you? Henry asked, changing the subject again. I was there, she said simply. Maybe I looked preoccupied, and he saw that as an opportunity. I have no idea. Did you learn anything from this experience? Anything you'll do differently now when returning to your car after job interviews? I'll look around more. I'll be more aware of where I am and who is nearby. I'll try to find someone to walk with me when I have to go someplace where it's dark or where it's deserted. I don't think it would have happened if there'd been other people around. Well, maybe it still would have, she said, reconsidering, but not as likely. Henry nodded encouragingly. So you've already planned a number of good steps to reduce the chance that this will happen to you again in the future. Yes. With his peripheral vision, Henry Bowman could see that the others in the room were nodding slightly and paying close attention. You're not worried about this man attacking you again? Henry asked with concern. No. Why? The woman was baffled now. Henry looked incredulous. He's got your credit cards and driver's license, so he knows where you live. He's seen your car, and he's got the keys to both it and your apartment, knowing you'd be stranded, unable to drive your car right away, and that you'd go to a doctor. He probably went straight to your place, let himself in, and rigged a window or two so he could get in later if you changed the locks right away. But I guess you weren't thinking about your own safety. You were much too overcome with guilt. The entire lecture hall was silent. What guilt? The young woman demanded, her eyes boring holes into his. It wasn't my fault I got attacked. No, it wasn't. But you learned several things from this attack. You told us that. Well, so did the man who robbed you. Henry held up a fist and began to tick off points on his fingers. First of all, he learned that robbing lone women in parking lots is easy. Second, he learned that it is a viable way to get money and access to vehicles and new victims. Third, he learned that victims sometimes resist a little, so he learned to hit them to make them do what he wants. Maybe he's learned that lesson well enough that next time he'll carry a lead pipe and hit the person first, so he doesn't have that problem. Henry pretended to have just thought of something. You know, I just realized if you've got a roommate and she was home when the attacker used your keys to let himself into your apartment, she may be dead by now. Or maybe she's just injured. If you're lucky, maybe the guy just scared the hell out of her as he did you. If she is dead, though, then you'll have to ask the coroner to find out if she was raped first. She won't be able to tell you. People tend to have friends that are like them, and a woman's purse tells a lot about its owner. If your purse had an address book in it, you've given this man a bunch of names, addresses, and unlisted phone numbers of new victims to choose from. Maybe when the man saw how you resisted, he decided from now on to stick to older victims. Maybe he'll punch out elderly people whose bodies can't take the kind of shocks yours can. We don't know the answer to that question. What we do know, Henry said, raising his voice, is that this man is not going to take your purse, go back to his apartment, and say, my final mugging. Time to look through the want ads and find a job. He is going to keep doing it. The other thing I can absolutely guarantee you is that you will not help put this man in jail now. Eyewitness testimony is the least reliable kind of evidence. If you identify a suspect in a lineup and claim that beyond doubt he's the one, you may well be helping to imprison an innocent man. Henry saw that the young woman was cowed and her eyes were filled with tears, but he pressed on. The time to do something is when you have the mugger right in front of you. The time to fight is when you are strong, not after you've been beaten. And the time and place to lose your dignity is in here, with me, where you'll get it back in 5 or 10 minutes, and you won't be left lying on the ground, bruised at best and maybe permanently crippled, with guilt eating at your guts that he's going to do it again to someone else, because you didn't stop him. Henry Bowman took a very deep breath and made eye contact with each of the pupils before him. Every one of them was waiting for his next words. My 10 minutes are up. No one replied. If you elect to stay in this course, you will be forced to face more issues such as the one you're thinking about right now. You will not hear about rape whistles and sisterhood support groups. If you stay in this course, you will learn why the worst handgun is 10 times better than the next best choice for saving your life. You will learn how to carry one at all times when it is possible, and how to improvise other methods of defense when it is not. You will develop the will to kill a violent attacker if necessary. You will learn exactly how to do it, and you will learn when to do it. Henry looked at the woman he had just interrogated. Are you willing to face those issues? He asked gently. The woman hesitated. Yes, she said finally with a firm nod. Me too, the first woman broke in. When you stuck that knife at my throat, I wet my pants and I wanted to rip your balls off. The other students became very animated at this revelation. You knew it too, didn't you? That's why there's towels and sweats in the bag, Henry said with a smile. He tapped his groin area with a ballpoint pen, and there was an unexpected sound. Also have on a plastic cup in case you did more than just think about it. Preparation is everything, he said, with a smile and arched eyebrows. The class erupted and Henry handed the woman the gym bag. So who's staying? He asked the group. The response was unanimous, and Henry was startled to see expressions of raw sexual interest on several faces in the group. Okay, fella, Henry thought to himself as his heart rate accelerated, don't get excited. That's the kind of thinking that's apt to screw this up big time. Bowman's boot camp, as it came to be known in the Pioneer Valley, was a success. In the 2 years before he graduated from college and left the area, Henry would teach over 300 women and 40 men. Henry would suspect, correctly, that most of the men were homosexuals who feared injury or death at the hands of fag bashers. In the period prior to Henry Bowman's graduation, several of Henry's former pupils would use what they had learned to stop violent assaults in the act and take the time to send Henry letters and newspaper clippings describing the events. 2 of the letter writers would credit Henry Bowman with saving their lives. Henry Bowman would be very proud of these letters and would value them more than his diploma. The sexual undercurrent that Henry Bowman noticed that first evening would be present to some degree in every class he taught, and Henry quickly came to see why so many college professors ended up having affairs with their pupils. Henry made a rule for himself that his own students were off limits until the last of the 6 evening sessions was over, but former students were just like any other girls his own age in a college town. Much to Henry's chagrin, he found that his female students' romantic interest in him generally disappeared after the course was over. In a few cases, though, it did not, and in the following 2 years, Henry ended up having 3 very pleasant involvements with women who had been in his personal protection class. Each of these 3 women would bestow on Henry Bowman a great deal of physical pleasure. One of them, however, would do him a favor that would prove to be of more lasting value. April 1st, 1973. Bill will never let you back on the field if he finds out, George Gavea said. You'll have to jump at Turner's Falls from now on. Henry Bowman noted with pleasure that George had not made some whiny comment about fearing for his own job at the parachuting school. It was one of the reasons that George was Henry's favorite employee at the Orange Sport Parachuting Center. We've got to do it. It's April Fool's, remember? Henry said. Look, we'll load up on the other side of the pumps. Bill won't see me taxi, and after that there's no proof, right? I guess you're right. No one's going to believe a chick throwing a hissy fit. Will the pilot go along with it? Henry asked. George snorted. He'd probably pay you to do it. He's got some other flying job lined up, and he's quitting in 2 weeks anyway. Then it's a go? Next jump run? Yeah, but we need a 5th person. We don't want Tom. He'd probably tell Stephanie, and you know how she is. Keith might try to fill me up. Rick's not here. We wouldn't want him. Lightning might strike twice, Henry warned with a laugh. Yeah, no shit, George replied, and broke up also. Is Carl Beck here? Haven't seen him today. Jesus, wouldn't he be perfect, though? Carl Beck was a cadaverous, one-eyed World War II vet. He had been shot to ribbons and left for dead in the European theater, and his sewn-up eye socket, tortuous limp, ruined jaw, and wispy hair made him look like an extra in a Boris Karloff movie. Carl had done the logical thing for a man who was completely disabled. He had taken up sport parachuting. In free fall, his disabilities vanished, and everyone on the airport liked jumping with Carl. He was a bit lackadaisical about packing his main parachute, however, and the joke at Orange was that Carl Beck was the only man around who could qualify for a Class A license, which required 25 jumps, on his reserve chute. Some years later, Carl would have his reserve chute fail as well, and he would land in a muddy drainage ditch at an estimated 85 miles an hour. After that, his limp became even worse, but he kept jumping. What about Franny, then? Henry asked. She's here. Would she pitch a bitch? Hell no. Yeah, she'd be perfect, and Bill will believe her if it comes to that. Great, Henry said. Here, give what's-his-name, the pilot. Give him my helmet to wear, and make sure he knows to go rich before restart. And make damn sure that even if she freaks out, that girl doesn't pull inside the plane, okay? That would ruin your day. Yeah, I can take care of that. Good point. We'll stick her in the far back. I'll trim it up for best, glide with no power before I go. And George, since I won't be there to see it, milk it real good, okay? Act as if you're all snarled up and can't get out for a while before letting the pilot take over, huh? This is going to be a good one, Henry, George Gavea said with a big grin. Henry Bowman nodded and started walking towards the shack which served as the airport restaurant. Like most activities that could loosely be called thrill sports, sport parachuting in 1973 was an activity practiced primarily by young men. College students of both sexes drove up to Orange every weekend to make the first and only parachute jump of their lives so they could say they did it. Very few women of that era, however, ever became experienced jumpers with instructors' ratings or had jump logbooks with hundreds of entries. Those that did achieve such measures of proficiency, however, were accepted as equals. Fast Franny Instrumentos was one of that group. Like almost all experienced jumpers, she liked a good gotcha, and more importantly, she felt no particular kinship to non-jumpers merely because they were of the same gender. That was important for what was about to happen. At Orange, as at every commercial drop zone in the country, an interested party could pay the same fee that the jumpers paid for their airlift and go on an observation flight. This meant that he or she got to ride in the plane with the parachutists, watch them jump out, and then land in the plane along with the pilot. Safety regulations required that in single-engine jump planes, all non-parachutists had to wear an emergency parachute in case of engine failure. Henry Bowman always thought this was a crazy rule. Jump planes stayed directly over whatever drop zone they serviced, and any pilot who had an engine failure directly over an airport and elected to abandon his aircraft did not deserve to have a pilot's license in the first place, in Henry's opinion. In spite of that, all drop zones around the country followed the rule. Pilots and observers in single-engine jump planes wore emergency parachutes. At almost every drop zone around the country, there was an equally important unwritten rule that the staff also followed. It took effect only when an exceptionally good-looking female signed up for an observation flight on a plane full of instructors and other experienced jumpers. The unwritten rule was that when the airplane got to jump altitude, the pilot pulled the throttle back to idle and told the observer that the engine had lost power and she was going to have to jump with the others. This practice had been going on almost as long as there had been sport jumpers and attractive female observers. Usually the woman would turn pale and occasionally screamed before the pilot opened the throttle and let her in on the joke. One young lady at Orange the year before had greatly endeared herself to the instructors. When given the news, she had nodded once in acceptance and then started to climb over the right seat of the Beech 18 to get to the door at the rear of the plane. The Beech was a twin, but the instructors had put a chute on her anyway, and the pilot had chopped both throttles. There were other good stories that the instructors liked to retell, but Henry's favorite was the legendary one that had occurred when the instructors had pulled the trick on a woman in a 10-person Nordeuan Norseman. The Orange facility owned 3 Norse Hogs, which were slow-flying 1940s-era military cargo aircraft, each powered by a single big radial engine. On the afternoon in question, the pilot gave the standard bad news to the observer, and then, as was custom, one of the instructors gave her the good news that it was just a joke. In this case, an instructor with the unlikely name of Rick Hustler had done the honors. What happened next varied according to who was telling the story and how much he had had to drink. What was not disputed was that the young woman threw her arms around Rick Hustler's neck and said, "Oh, thank you," or some other equally appropriate words of gratitude. The second thing that was never disputed was that when the plane passed over the exit point, Rick Hustler elected not to jump out of the aircraft with the rest of the jumpers and actually landed in the plane with his new admirer. What transpired between the time the jumpers exited and the time the plane landed was cause for great speculation, but there was a third undisputed fact about the incident. Within a year, Rick Hustler and the young woman were husband and wife. Henry Bowman was about to elevate this standard drop zone prank into an art form. He didn't know it, but in so doing, he was also going to help the pilot get what he would later say was the best blowjob I ever had in my life. Since Henry did not know the man well, he would be unable to assess whether this was an impressive claim or not. Henry smiled as he bit into his hamburger. Henry thought the Orange Airport hamburgers were the best to be had in Massachusetts. When he saw through the restaurant window that the 4 people were standing around the Cessna 180 waiting for the pilot, Henry popped the last bite into his mouth and ran out the door. "Sorry I'm late," Henry apologized as he slowed to a walk in front of the group. "No problem," Franny Stromino said immediately. "I was just telling Debbie here the most comfortable way to sit. She's never been cramped up in a plane with no seats." "Let's get in," said the man whose name Henry had forgotten. He was wearing a single emergency chute. "I haven't made any jumps yet today." Henry and George bit their lips to keep from laughing. The Cessna 180 was set up as a jump aircraft, which meant it had all its seats removed save the one for the pilot, and would now hold 5 people instead of 4. A special jump door had been installed that hinged at the top and could be opened all the way in flight. The observer got in first and sat with her knees bunched. Up alongside the rear bulkhead, Fran Stromeno sat facing her, and George got in next. Then Henry climbed into the pilot's seat, and the other man sat on the floor where the passenger seat would normally have been, facing rearward. Henry Bowman quickly ran through the pre-flight checklist and started the engine. He taxied the plane immediately and kept his face turned to the left. He did not want the drop zone's owner to see that the man who was flying his jump aircraft was not the person he had hired to perform that job. The 180 was a tailwheel airplane like Henry's acrobatic Cub, and its ground handling was similar, although the pedal effort was higher. Henry taxied to the end of the runway, did his engine run-up and magneto check, mumbled something unintelligible into the microphone, and pulled out onto the runway centerline. He pushed the throttle to full and held the yoke forward, keeping the plane straight with quick stabs on the rudder pedals. As the tail came up, he eased the yoke back and let the airplane fly itself off the runway. Decent power for a Spam can, he thought with a smile. Henry had a tube and rag pilot's disdain for all metal airplanes. Although modern equipment allows sport parachutists to glide to a landing virtually anywhere they choose, in 1973, many jumpers had chutes of limited maneuverability, and the first high-performance gliding reserve chutes were still 6 years away. Thus, jumpers always strove to exit the aircraft at the proper point upwind of their intended landing spot, so that if they ended up having to deploy a non-steerable reserve chute, they would still end up somewhere on the airport and not in the woods. Normally, when a jump aircraft gets to jump altitude, this is accomplished by one of the jumpers opening the door, holding his head out so he can see straight down, and giving the pilot hand corrections to put him over a spot that has been pre-selected based on other jump runs or a test with a crepe paper streamer. On this flight, however, Henry Bowman was going to have to guess. It took Henry 17 minutes of circling the airport to get to an altitude of 7,500 feet above the ground. By that time, he had a good feel for the wind velocity and direction, and he turned the aircraft into the wind and flew directly over the big sand landing bowl that was in the center of the 3 runways. A quarter mile past the parachutist's intended landing point, Henry Bowman trimmed the airplane a little nose up, pulled the mixture control to full lean, and brought the throttle back to idle position. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the jump pilot on the floor next to him draw his breath in sharply. In 4 seconds, the engine sputtered and stopped running. Henry had just fuel-starved it. The airplane was suddenly very quiet. "What's wrong?" Franny Stromenos yelled, her voice almost cracking. "Nice touch," Franny Henry Bowman thought with a smile. "Perpetuate the stereotype?" "I don't know," Henry yelled back. Bill warned me the jetting was off, but he said he couldn't afford to have the plane in the shop. Henry saw the pilot's face turn bright red as the man forced himself to contain his laughter. All the employees thought the airport owner was a tightwad. Henry put his right hand on the ignition key, looked at the man on the floor next to him, arched his eyebrows, and removed the key. A look of horrified comprehension came over the man's face, and he grabbed Henry's wrist. Henry slid the key back in the ignition, let go of it, and winked. "Just checking to see if you were paying attention." "Is the plane going to crash?" The shapely woman in the back of the plane screamed as she strained to see what was going on. Henry turned around in the pilot's seat and made sure he had solid eye contact with the girl before he spoke. "I'm sure as shit not going to stay in it and find out," he said in a loud voice. Then he reached across the real pilot's outstretched legs, unlatched the jump door, and swung it up against the wing. Henry stared in the girl's eyes once more. "See you on the ground," he said. Then Henry Bowman dove headfirst out of the aircraft. Henry bent slightly forward at the waist and bent his elbows so that he would fall in a back-to-earth position. He wanted to watch the airplane to see what would happen. Since the pilot had borrowed Henry's goggles as well as his helmet, Henry squinted so that his eyes wouldn't tear. It was a full 10 seconds before he saw a bright red jumpsuit appear. "There's Franny." He glanced at the altimeter on his chest strap. 6,300 feet. Henry watched the plane for another 10 count, but George didn't exit, so he flipped to a face to earth. Position, glanced at his altimeter, and got his bearings. 4,800 feet. Need to get over the north edge of the farmer's field. Henry bent sideways at the waist to turn towards the field, then drew his arms into his sides, cupped his hands forward, hunched his shoulders, and pointed his toes. He was now falling in a track, traveling almost 1 foot horizontally for every foot down. His speed through the air was over 200 miles per hour. At 3,000 feet, Henry was over the proper spot, and he spread his arms and legs out wide. It felt as if he had entered a thicker layer of atmosphere as his body slowed to about 130 miles per hour. At 2,400 feet, Henry pulled his ripcord and grabbed the nylon web risers that stretched out above his shoulders. He wanted to take some of the opening shock in his arms instead of entirely on the inside of his thighs. The rectangular parachute opened abruptly with a ripping noise, and Henry was slowed to a quiet and leisurely 9-mile-an-hour descent. The Ram Air inflated wing design had almost 30 miles per hour of forward speed, and Henry flew his parachute around the airport until he got within a few hundred feet of the ground. Then he aimed it upwind and stalled it out when his shoes were a few feet off the ground in the middle of the sand bowl. He ran downwind and grabbed his chute before the wind could catch it and drag him. Then he looked up in the air. Franz Tremenos had opened high and was flying her Ram Air chute around the sky. George Gouveia had evidently pulled at the standard altitude of 2,500 feet. He was about 1,500 feet above the ground, hanging upside down in his harness. It was George's trademark. He had been a tumbler in school. George waited until he was 20 feet above the ground before flipping over and landing on his feet, then collapsed his chute and walked over to Henry. The two of them looked up in the sky. Franny did her terrified broad act and finally jumped out. I asked Dick if he wanted to jump before me. He said something about how he could see how scared the girl was, and he flew in a plane once, and he was going to try to restart the engine and see if he could land it because the observer was obviously panicked, and he didn't want her to have to jump. I waited till he did a restart before I got out. So she still thinks her pilot has never landed a plane before? Henry demanded as he stared at the descending aircraft, which was now at 500 feet altitude on final approach. This is really great. Then he thought of something. Jesus, I hope she doesn't decide it's too risky and bail out about now. Wouldn't that be a bummer? The pair watched as the pilot brought the 180 in for a smooth landing. When it pulled onto the taxiway, Henry stuck out his hand and grinned. Happy April Fool's Day, George. That it is. May 7th, 1973. And so, Hobbes said that our lives are nasty, brutish, and short, and he used that as justification for the dictatorial powers of the monarch. Only by granting the state total power will we ever overcome our natural condition, which is to be perpetually at war with one another. The political science course the professor was teaching was listed in the course catalog with a dry-sounding title that no one remembered. Throughout the Amherst campus, it was referred to as right and wrong. Henry Bowman liked the class mainly because the professor who taught it had a very sharp mind. Hobbes is just talking about our old friend, And with this, the lecturer gestured with his arm to show the class he wanted someone to finish the sentence for him. Benevolent dictatorship, a senior in the second row said quickly. Exactly, Mr. Hagner. Hobbes' Leviathan is just one more scholarly justification for forfeiting your rights and allowing yourself to be subjugated by the state. Learned, reasoned, articulate, and wrong. Thomas Hobbes has merely... Mr. Bowman, the professor said suddenly, you are shaking your head. That usually means you disagree with something that's been said. What is it? Professor Ark said, don't disagree with the basic principle, but it's not enough just to say totalitarian regimes are wrong, so don't let the state enslave you. That's like saying, don't get sick. The important question is, when do you know it's going to become enslavement? When is the proper time to resist with force? Please elaborate, Mr. Bowman. Henry took a deep breath. The end result, which we want to avoid, is the concentration camp, the gulag, the gas chamber, the Spanish Inquisition, all of those things. If you are in a death camp, no one would fault you for resisting. But when you're being herded towards the gas chamber, naked and 70 pounds below your healthy weight, it's too late. You have no chance. On the other hand, no one would support you if you started an armed rebellion because the government posts speed limits on open roads and arrests people for speeding. So when was it not too late, but also not too early? Tell us, Mr. Bowman. Professor Arks, I teach a personal protection class off campus, where most of the students who sign up are women. I'm seeing some strong parallels here, so please indulge me in an analogy. Go ahead. A woman's confronted by a big, strong stranger. She doesn't know what he's planning and she's cautious. Getting away from him's not possible. They're in a room and he's standing in front of the only way out, or she's in a wheelchair, whatever. Leaving the area is not an option. So now he starts to do things she doesn't like. He asks her for money. She can try to talk him out of it, just like we argue for lower taxes, and maybe it will work. If it doesn't, and she gets outvoted, she'll probably choose to give it to him instead of getting into a fight to the death over $10. You would probably choose to pay your taxes rather than have police arrive to throw you in jail. Maybe this big man demands some other things, other minor assaults on this woman's dignity. When should she claw at his eyes or shove her ballpoint pen in his throat? When he tries to force her to kiss him, tries to force her to let him touch her, tries to force her to have sex with him? Henry took a deep breath and shrugged. Those are questions that each woman has to answer for herself. There is one situation, though, where I tell the women to fight to the death. That's when the man pulls out a pair of handcuffs and says, "Come on, I promise I want to hurt you. This is just so you won't flail around and hurt either of us by accident. Come on, I just want to talk. Get in the van and let me handcuff you to this eye bolt here, and I promise I won't touch you. I'm not asking you to put on a gag or anything, and since you can still scream for help, you know you'll be safe. Come on, I got a full bar in here, and color TV, and air conditioning, great stereo. Come on, just put on the cuffs." I tell women that if that ever happens, maybe the man is telling the truth, and maybe after talking to her. For a while he'll let her go, and she will have had a good time drinking champagne and listening to music. But if she gets in the van and puts her wrists in the handcuffs, she has just given up her future ability to fight, and now it is too late. Henry realized he had been making eye contact with all the other people in the lecture hall, just as he did when he taught a course. Now he looked directly at the professor. How do you spot the precise point where a society is standing at the back of the van and the state has the handcuffs out? That's the question I'd like to see addressed by one of these philosophers we've been studying, Professor. Mr. Bowman, that's a very good point, and I wish now that you had brought it up 6 weeks ago. I might have given it for the semester's final paper assignment. Most of the class laughed at this comment, and Henry smiled. For the rest of his life, Henry Bowman would ruminate over the issue he had raised in class that day. "Excellent," Henry said as the final 6 bullets from the small pistol clanged satisfyingly against the circular steel plate. The metal disc was hanging 15 feet away, suspended from a tree limb by 2 coat hangers. Danielle Pelletier and Henry Bowman had been out at Quabbin Reservoir all morning. It was a gorgeous place, rocky and secluded, with no other people for over a mile. It was the first time Danielle had been out there alone, instead of with the whole class. Danielle saw that the pistol slide remained in the retracted position, and she looked into the loading port at the magazine to verify that the gun was indeed empty. She laid the weapon down carefully in the open hard case next to the now empty ammunition box. The gun's muzzle pointed downrange. Danielle stripped off her hearing protectors and shooting glasses, and a big grin filled her pretty face. "How was that? Am I getting the hang of it?" She waited for the compliment that she knew was coming. "You don't need to ask," Henry said. "With steel plates, you can hear if you've hit the vital zone." He smiled back, but a look of concern came over his face as he started to pack up the shooting gear and put it away. He appeared to be choosing his words carefully before continuing. "Shooting steel plates and other targets is great fun, and I have loved doing it all my life. But don't ever forget the real reason to practice. If you ever do have to use your defensive shooting skills, an awful lot of things are going to be going through your mind and body that you will never have experienced out here practicing. That's something that takes a different kind of practice, and it's why I always harp about it in the lectures." Danielle looked thoughtful. "Mental and emotional preparation, you mean?" The warrior mentality? Exactly. And for some people, that's much harder to learn than the skills part. It's also much harder for me to teach, and I wish I knew how to improve. Henry continued to stow their gear in the back of the car. The young woman had a knowing look on her face as she looked at her companion. Then that explains something I was wondering about. Henry cocked his head and raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. When you didn't seem to notice that I was flirting with you, I thought maybe you were brain dead. This got a big grin out of him, and he chewed the inside of his cheek. You mean you didn't think I noticed you tossing your head to throw your hair back every few minutes? Didn't think I realized you were standing closer to me than you needed to when I was explaining how to see if a gun is loaded? Didn't think I felt you rubbing your boob against my arm when I was helping you get your grip right? Didn't think I watched your nipples get hard? And didn't think I saw you clench the muscles in your ass every time you had your back to me? Danielle started to blush. You realize more than I thought. I not only noticed, I liked it, he said softly. This got her attention, and she looked up into his eyes. It's just that it would be wrong if I let us get distracted from something very important that demands concentration. You said you took my course because you wanted to be able to defend yourself, and you sounded completely serious. I was serious. I know you were. I don't think either one of us says things we don't mean. And learning how to effectively and safely protect yourself with a deadly weapon is something that requires all of your attention. He paused and gave her a big smile. At least while you are actually doing it, which I notice we aren't anymore. She came over to him, put her arms around his neck, and rubbed her chest lightly against his. So I can do this now? Danielle asked playfully, looking up into his eyes. You'd better, Henry said as his hands gripped her small waist. But first help me pack up the rest of our gear. She opened the back of the car and looked quizzically at a large, flat metal object in the back of the vehicle, padded with black vinyl and with what appeared to be a piano hinge running its length. What's this thing? Danielle demanded. Massage table, Henry replied, sliding the gun case and range bag into the back of the vehicle. I borrowed it from the rugby team. Have to get it back by tomorrow morning. Why do you have a massage table in the back of your car? She asked accusingly. Henry grabbed the final ammo can, put it in the back, and pulled the table out of the vehicle. I thought your muscles might be tired after this morning. I also thought it would be a good way to find out just what your body likes best, Henry said casually as he unfolded the padded table and set it up at the back of the car. Danielle watched as he opened the gym bag and took out a large towel which he spread on the vinyl surface. Henry poked around in the gym bag and pulled out a large towel, a t-shirt, a can of hand cleaner, and a plastic bottle filled with what looked like shampoo. Here, he said, holding out the large towel. Take off your clothes and lie on your stomach, he said, indicating the table and relieved that his voice didn't crack. Cover yourself with the towel. I'm going to go change shirts and clean some of this powder residue off my hands. He kept his face impassive as he turned away, but his heart was pounding. Danielle stared dumbfounded at Henry Bowman, but found herself stepping out of her shoes. Her fingers slowly unbuttoned the denim work shirt, and she let it fall to the ground. She unzipped the tight, faded jeans and pushed them down her hips. When Henry came back around the car, Danielle was standing next to the massage table. She wore matching bra and panties that were made of a fine beige material that was almost transparent. Her erect nipples were evident, as was the small brown patch of fine pubic hair 5 inches below her navel. She looked absolutely stunning. He stared at her, his head canted, a questioning look on his face. He started to speak, but she cut him off forcefully. This morning, before I got dressed in old blue jeans and a man's work shirt because we were going shooting, I planned a little surprise for you for when we came back. I put on the sexiest and most outrageously expensive set of underwear I've ever owned, and I'll be damned if I'm going to take them off, toss them in a pile, and cover myself up with a towel before you tell me how absolutely, totally hot I look in them. She turned around to give him the rear view and slowly, deliberately clenched the muscles in her firm ass. When she turned back to face him, they were both grinning. Henry nodded his head in obvious appreciation. Do you want me to take them off now? Danielle asked innocently. Henry nodded again. Danielle unhooked her bra and stepped out of her panties. She settled comfortably onto the padded surface, stretched out on her stomach, and let her toes hang over the sides of the table. Start with my bottom, she instructed. Henry drew his breath in sharply. What have you gotten yourself into here, fella? He thought. This is, a non-sexual massage, Henry said lamely, then immediately felt like an idiot. Danielle sighed, closed her eyes, and smiled happily. We'll see about that. May 8th, 1973. So, we've talked about everything else. What's your view on the war? Danielle Pelletier asked, as she rearranged one of the pillows and propped herself up on an elbow. You think it will end before you get drafted? Henry Bowman stretched, put his hands behind his head, and stared at the ceiling. I won't get drafted, no matter how long it goes on. I tried to enlist, but they wouldn't take me. There's still a big stainless steel rod in this leg. Military won't take you with foreign metal in your body. What? Yep, that's their rule, though I'm not sure why they have that policy. For some reconstructive work, the steel is temporary, and they take it out after the bones heal, but in my case, they said, No, I mean, you enlisted? You wanted to go? Are you out of your mind? Danielle was sitting up now, and Henry found himself admiring her chest. That wasn't it, Henry said with a sigh. Lots of things bother me about the war. Enlisting was the best way to avoid the worst part of the whole mess. What do you mean? I mean, this just blows my mind. Your whole bag. The thing you always talk about in the protection class is that each one of us is responsible for ourselves. Ourselves, Henry. You always talk about personal freedom, about individual rights, about how being a policeman just entitles you to arrest people for misdemeanors. She became more animated as she spoke. About how the police are just the historians there to write it down after it's already happened and more interested in handing out traffic tickets than anything else. Henry, you hate it when the government says you have to go get a permit to buy a gun, or to carry it with you, and how some places they won't let you carry it for protection at all. Now you tell me you want to join those same people and go over and meddle in somebody else's business in another country when nobody has a clue as to what they're doing. She drew away from him as she spoke. Everything you said is true, Henry replied, except the part about wanting to meddle in other people's business. Let me finish, he commanded, holding up a hand. You are absolutely right when you say I believe that each one of us should determine our own destiny. You are also right about how our goals over there aren't particularly well defined. He furrowed his brow and went on. But the first priority is me. Volunteering to jump into a war I didn't much understand, let alone believe in, wasn't nearly as terrifying as getting drafted into that war. What's the difference? What's the difference? Henry repeated. Jesus Christ, Danielle, get drafted and you have no control over your future whatsoever. You can easily get thrown in with a bunch of shitbums whose only goal is to get high and who have no reservations about lobbing a grenade into their CD's tent if they think he might give them an order to go into battle. Enlist, and you can make sure that the people you end up with are ones you can count on to back you up, not shoot you in the back. He looked into her eyes. There's no conscripts in the special forces. Danielle took a moment to think that over. I guess that makes sense, she said finally. Except it still surprises me. The idea of you taking orders, I mean. Girls say yes to guys who say no, you mean? He teased as he reached between her legs. Stop that, she laughed. Danielle Pelletier had participated half-heartedly in several war protests and was well aware that most of the young men involved in them were there to get laid. Henry smiled, then became serious again. Sometimes taking orders, at least for a while, is your best option, he said. But you should always keep as many options open as possible, especially involving the government. Why do I have the feeling you're about to tell me something new? Something that's interesting and maybe a little scary, like in your class? Danielle asked. Woman's intuition? Henry offered. I'm serious, she countered. Henry nodded. One of the biggest ways to keep your options open is to be able to start with a clean slate if need be. Go on. To be able to step into another identity and kiss off the one with the problems. What, you mean like so you can get rid of a bad credit rating or something? Skip out on the rent payment? No, I mean more like not getting thrown into a concentration camp in California in 1942 because your name is Edward Anderson with an address in Ohio instead of Ito Hamada from Los Angeles. Henry saw her quizzical look and went on. People think of fake IDs as what you use to scam people. You know, get into strip joints, get booze when you're 19, get a credit card and then tear up the bills, that kind of thing. You can use them for that, but then they're shot if you really get in a jam. What I'm talking about is a lot more important than ripping off some credit card company for a few extra bucks. More like ripping off the Grim Reaper for a few extra decades. He smiled at her and continued, Time to do something is when you can, and you got lots of time and no pressure, right? Not when the deadline's tomorrow. Krauts come knock on your door, say Guten Tag, Frau Epstein, mach schnell to der Soap Factory, and you tell them your name's Adams, and you pull out a driver's license issued last week and a checkbook printed yesterday, and your matching luggage happens to be monogrammed with a big E. Well, nice try. But if you've got a 2-year-old driver's license and a stack of paid credit card bills from the last 15 years and canceled checks over the last decade, 12-year-old membership to a gym, and a copy of a birth certificate that was issued and notarized 8 years ago, and all these things are in the name of Adams, well, maybe you won't end up as lather in some guy's armpit. At least not this week. If the Krauts never come, and they probably won't, you wasted a little time over the years setting up the other jacket, just like the time you wasted working to pay for fire insurance all those years that your house didn't burn down. Danielle's eyes were bright. So what's your other identity, Henry? What name, I mean? I've got 3. 3? She squealed. 3 males, about my age, that I have birth certificates for, and driver's licenses, and credit cards, and other stuff. Each with a different address. I also have 3 women's birth certificates, but I couldn't very well pretend to be female and rent a post office box, apply for a driver's license, all that, so all I've got there is the 3 birth certificates. Why 3 women? Danielle asked, certain she knew the answer. Henry Bowman took a deep breath and stared at the ceiling. Several reasons, he said. Because I was drunk and it was fun, he answered silently. First of all, the whole point is to plan for the unexpected in the distant future, and in 20 years I could easily be married. So I had to get several, for different eye color and like that. Second, even if I was single and unattached, a ready-made ID with a long history that'd stand up would be worth a fair bit of money to someone with more immediate problems, don't you think? Particularly if I could supply one that matched the person's description. I want to buy one of your birth certificates now, Danielle said immediately. Sorry, but none of the 3 I have lists world-class butt in the official description. Henry held up his arms as Danielle started to punch him. Seriously, he said, after she had stopped hitting him. I'll give you one, and help you get others if you want, if you'll help me get some of the other stuff done, like driver's licenses and P.O. boxes. It's actually kind of fun, and I've looked at the legal statutes to see how serious a crime it is. Near as I can tell, if you don't do anything with your new identity to cheat anyone, or apply for a passport, I think they'd have a tough time prosecuting you at all. And if they did, you'd just turn into someone else. Exactly. So when do we start? How about in, say, another hour? Henry suggested, pulling back the sheet. Goodness. Has that been there all this time? Danielle asked as she slid a pillow under her stomach and lifted her bottom slightly. Pretty much, yes, Henry admitted. Well, bring him on over here.